The topic of my presentation will be very much sort of in line with some of the discussions we've already had, but I feel a bit nervous as a geographer to be talking about sort of historical matters, but I hope the historians will sort of bear with me. Yes. A few words on the title, Universities and Their Spatial Locations. I came up with that title when I saw the first invitations for this symposium, which was Universities and Their Spatial Relations. So I thought that would be sort of fun play with words. Then the title of this symposium changed, so perhaps I should have changed the title of my presentation accordingly, because it's not a paper on locations as we usually talk about it in geography, which would be sort of, it's different from that. So I think a more appropriate title now would have been Geographies of University Founding or University Establishment, because that's what I'm going to be talking about. The idea for this presentation was actually, it came after I was talking to some colleagues about sort of Danish universities and talking about what is the first university and the second university in Denmark, and what people would normally answer if you ask them, or if you look up on the internet, Danish universities, it would be University of Copenhagen, that's the oldest university. Then the next one would be four would be these four. Aarhus University from 1928, Odense 1966, Roskilde 1972, Aalborg 1974. And I was talking to Howard yesterday, and he said, well, 19? Did you say 19 for the next 19 something for the next university, from the second university in Denmark? And I said, yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? 450 years and nothing happening. And I could hear from England that was the case. Well, you had quite a few years with nothing happening there. But in fact, but Denmark usually doesn't compare to England. So if we look to Sweden, you would say, well, 450 years nothing happening. That's not the case there. They had the first university in Uppsala in 1477. They beat us by 2 years, which is not entirely correct, but we can come back to that. So we had the founding of the first university almost at the same time. So, but then in Sweden they had Lund, they have Gothenburg, they have Stockholm. So how come nothing happened in Denmark? So is that correct at all? And that's what I started looking into. So if we are looking at what happened in the state of Denmark, we'll get a quite different picture, having sort of looking at it from a historical point of view, because now you may notice that I've called it the state of Denmark, and that's sort of the key to my presentation. That is, how do we define Denmark? Because then the next university would be University of Kiel, which most people today would say is in Germany, but and it was also in Germany when it was established. We've been trying to get it back. We got it back at some point and lost it again. So that was actually, it was the second university in the state of Denmark. The third, University of Oslo. The fourth, University of Serampore. Anybody who knows where Serampore is? That's in India. So you see, you have to sort of expand your notion of Denmark, right? The fourth, University of Iceland. And then we get to Aarhus University and the rest. So what happened during those 450 years was actually a university to the south in Germany in 1665, University of Oslo in 1811, University of Serampore 1827, and University of Iceland 1911. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. That was what got me intrigued. Why would you have a university in these places? What was the story about university establishment? Where do we locate universities? That was what got me intrigued. But also, if we go beyond the universities I've just mentioned, we have University of Greenland, which is still part of the Danish kingdom. We have also University of the Faroe Islands. So you see, you thought I was talking about this tiny country, Denmark, but actually it's almost like the British Empire, you see. So the objective here is using Denmark as a case. What I want to understand is how I want to understand the geography of university funding. And I think that was kind of the question that Mike was asking previously this morning, so I was pleased to hear that question. So why were universities established and located in a certain place? And the way I'm going to study this is inspired by David Harvey's ideas about geography, so it's what he would call a relative and relational geography. So it's not only about what he would call an absolute geography. Absolute geography is about maps, that's coordinates, that's something you can measure in meters. This is an absolute geography I'm wearing here. And a relative geography, that would be distance in relation to something, like in relation to time often. And when we talk about globalization, it's very much about a relative geography, how the world has become smaller because we can travel faster. And then he talks about a relational geography, and that's when we include history and politics, for instance. Borders cannot be explained by an absolute or geography. You need a relative a relational geography in order to understand borders. So that's just to sort of have a very swift introduction to Harvey's ideas about geography. And what I would also like to do, sort of in a very modest way, is trying to contribute to providing a geographical perspective on university history. And that's what we've had this during this morning as well, having geography added to university history. And this is a geographer trying to do that. And in that, I'm inspired by David Livingstone's Geography of the Scientific Knowledge, which we also saw the title of his book previously, Putting Science in Its Place. And I can highly recommend that book for those of you who are not aware of it. So that was that was our objective. So now to the content, so you know what we should be going through. First of all, I think it's very important that we know what we're talking about, to have a few conceptualizations. What is a university and what is a country? Obviously, especially the latter is important for my presentation. Then the main question, how has establishment of universities been used? Why was a certain location chosen? And I'll analyze this in two different ways. First, an analysis of the universities in Denmark. That is an institutional analysis, you might call it, where I look at each of the universities. And then an analysis of a borderland, which is more like a regional analysis. And I should say that the paper, I haven't written that on my own. I have a co-author who is a historian who has specialized in the Danish-German border region. So I have somebody to help me getting all the information correct. But as we have heard already, history, especially in that part of the world, when we get closer to present-day Germany, it's a very complex thing. So following that, I'm trying to make a typology, and if I may suggest how we're going to spend half an hour after my presentation, that's where I would like the help of all the qualified people here. It's to see, does this typology make sense? Does it make sense to make a typology at all? Does that typology, would that be interesting, relevant for other countries than Denmark? Or is that such a particular case that perhaps it's not even that interesting? And finally, some concluding remarks. Okay, first a few definitions, and we've already been there, but this is just to mention that what a university is not that straightforward. When you try to look for when was this university established, you need to find out what do you mean by that. And of course, what I'm referring to is the university that we know of as the University of Bologna and the Paris and that type, and not going back to like this is supposedly an image of Plato's Academy. So I'm referring to the classical European university, and not disregarding that we've had learned institutions all over the world, especially in connection to religious centers for many centuries. But that's what I'm focusing on. And what's important in this context is also that when you're looking at the year of establishment, you need some sort of definition as well, and that is what we've been looking at here, is when the university actually had an official status or authorization as a university. And that could be given, at first it was given by the Pope, and then later by kings or emperors in different parts of Europe. So that's why we picked the dates we have. And quite often we will see the dates can vary a bit, but like it's often seen in this, like here, 1088, and that's what I've sort of used. Well, so Universities of Denmark. This is the list I'll be looking at. You could also, when you're trying to define a university, you may also include the latter three, which are included by the lobbying organization called Danish Universities. The Technical University of Denmark and the Copenhagen Business School and the IT University, they were, until 2003, they were not considered universities. They didn't have the official status as a university. They were what you in German would call Hochschule, like what you've also left out of your analysis, I believe, Johannes. And but they were given that official status in 2003. But I think they're so different because they don't have the different range of faculties that we shouldn't include them. Although it's worth mentioning that the Technical University of Denmark actually was established in 1829, so it is a fairly old institution. But I don't look into those three. So what is a state? Just briefly, inspired by Max Weber, it's a confined territory considered as an organized political community. And what's the typical definition as well? It's where you have a monopoly on violence. Historically, as we've heard, you can even also have different rulers for the same territory. And in the case of Schleswig-Holstein, that's what you can see, that even the same territory can sort of respond to different rulers at the same time, and that's what makes this whole history so complicated. We have monarchies, we have kingdoms, we have duchies. In the Danish case, you have the Danish monarchy, which consists, at some points in history, it consists both of a kingdom and of duchies at the same time, and consists in different territories. And then we have this movement, as we've heard about this morning as well, towards a nation state. And the history of the Danish universities is also very much this movement towards nation state. So Denmark, as we see it today, that's where it is, small country. Then I like this map, which I found on Wikipedia. And please notice that I have actually made it as small as possible. Because, well, I should say that talking about Denmark doesn't really make sense until around 1460. And the state we were talking about, or the monarchy we were talking about back then, would be the Composite State, including Norway. So the Kingdom of Norway, the Kingdom of Denmark, and the southern part of Sweden. We lost the southern part of Sweden in 1658, when this map is illustrating the situation. And then on top of that, we also had the Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands. And then colonies, West Indies, here the Gold Coast, Ghana, and Tranquebar, this is called Serampore, this is where the university was located, and then the Nicobar Islands. So quite spread out colonies. Then in 1814, what happened then was that Denmark lost Norway because we were on the wrong side in the Napoleonic Wars. So Norway became part of Sweden back then. So it was a sort of a fairly big country that shrunk due to the different wars that we've also heard a bit about. So Denmark in 1815, this is actually a French map. And you can see we have the white, that's the kingdom. Then we have the yellow, that's a duchy of Schleswig. The green is a duchy of Holstein, and the blue is Lauenburg. So that's what we're talking about. And then what they have also included here, up there, you can see Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands. So that's the situation in 1815. Just to try to define this quite varying territory, the state of Denmark. So how has establishment of universities been used? And as I said, we have analyzed this as two different levels. And I'll just provide a brief overview of these different universities in this table. The first was University of Copenhagen. That was, Copenhagen didn't become the capital until around 1420, when the king at that time, Erik af Pommern, he decided to relocate the capital from Roskilde to Copenhagen. And then he thought it would be great having a university, so he asked the Pope for permission, and he got the permission to establish a university, but he didn't get the permission to have a full university he wasn't allowed to have theology, and apparently because the Pope didn't want theology that far north, he didn't know how they would interpret religion if it was too far away. That is how I understand it. Then, for various war reasons, he never got around to establishing the university. And it wasn't until 1475 that the Danish king then, King Christian I, got the permission again, because it was only the first permission was only valid for 2 years. So within that time period, he didn't make his university. Then back in 1475, Christian I asked for permission, and he got the permission, but didn't get round to establishing a university until 79. And in the meantime, the Swedes had heard about it, so they beat him. So they got the permission later, but they established the university in Uppsala 2 years earlier. And the university in Copenhagen is located next to the cathedral, which was the first image that we actually saw. The next university was the University of Kiel, as I mentioned, and that was established in 1665, which was 7 years after the Duchy of Schleswig-Holstein-Gottorp had been declared independent of the state of Denmark. And the Duke at that time, Christian Albrecht, he was living in this small duchy, having Denmark on the one side and much more terrifying. He was also part of the Holy Roman Empire, and he wanted to show that his strength, and he couldn't do that with military strength. He knew that wasn't really a possibility. So what he said, that he wanted to show his strength in terms of knowledge and culture. So he wanted a university. That would be a great way of proving what a great ruler he was. So he was allowed to fund a university. And then when the duchy became part of Denmark again in 1773, the Danish king didn't know whether it was a good idea having a university there or not. So sometimes they said, well, we shouldn't support the university in Kiel, and then sometimes they said, well, actually, it's a good idea having a university there. So there have been sort of rivalries between the University of Copenhagen and the University of Kiel. Then I've included the University of Lund, even though that was established after we lost that part of Sweden, Scania. And the reason why we included it in the analysis is that it's such a beautiful example of the geopolitics, if you want, of university location. Because the University of Lund was established in 1666, which was only 6 years after that part of what used to be Denmark became part of Sweden. And thinking back then, it only took them 6 years to establish a university, which was actually, I think, pretty fast. And the reason why they wanted to establish a university there, so far away from the capital and sort of the mainland Sweden, was that they wanted to make that part of Sweden Swedish. It was so close to Copenhagen, University of Lund. What is that? I don't know how many kilometers. It takes 1 hour by train, so it's fairly close to Copenhagen. So they wanted that part of Sweden to become Swedish, and that's why they established a university there. And I think that's an interesting story, and when we're trying to understand why were universities established one place and not the other, and then why Lund, why not any of the other towns in that area. And that was because it was very important, and it was an important cathedral, so as in terms of religion it was very important. So then the University of Oslo. That was established in 1811, but only after the people of Norway had asked and begged for university for more than 150 years. And they were ruled by the Danish king, and he didn't want a university there because he was afraid by establishing a university in Norway that would just strengthen their wish for independence, because knowledge is power, and that was also giving the local people the power to sort of educate their own people, and he wasn't interested in that. So most Norwegians would go to, at first they went to Rostock for education, then they also went to Copenhagen, and at some point the king wouldn't allow even people from Norway going to Rostock without having spent 2 years in Copenhagen first. You see, that's how the king, he quite often had these ideas that you should study in Copenhagen before going somewhere else. And that's how space matters and locality matters, because now we are at a point in time where we've been becoming more and more aware of this sort of local nature of knowledge as well that we've heard about as well, or that knowledge should become more localized. So finally, in 1811, the king gave in, said, okay, you can have your own university. And then only 3 years later, Denmark lost Norway. So it was only for a 3-year period, but still, it was our third university, you might say. Then you have the case of what's called the the Senate of Serampore College. That was founded in 1827 and actually had nothing to do with Denmark, apart from the fact that that was a Danish colony. But it was founded by 3 British missionaries who were very, they worked hard and they were very, I think, sort of intelligent in terms of what they wanted to do, also with religion, and they had a freedom there that they didn't necessarily have in other places. And they wanted to translate the Bible into all sorts of Indian languages, so they're very much into linguistics. And at some point, they wanted to establish a university, and they asked the Danish king for permission, and he said, that's okay. And as it were, it was actually the first university in India, the first university which actually had an authority or authorization as an Indian university, which I think is quite a strange story, how the first Indian university was actually granted its permission from the Danish king. And then the next university is the University of Iceland, and again that's sort of related to the whole wish for independence, that people ask, well, can't we have a university? They struggle, they fight, and finally they got a university, but only 7 years after they had received home rule were they allowed to have a university. And the reason why they also wanted a university was that they wanted to be able to have knowledge production and education in their own country. And so what they also had was a faculty of Icelandic, where they could study Icelandic history, and not least the Icelandic saga. What do you say in English? Saga, yeah. And they already had, well, schools of medicine and schools of theology, so it wasn't that difficult to sort of create a full university. So that's the story up until the point where we usually start telling the Danish university history. So then we have Aarhus University, and, well, what I should say here is then we reach the end of the First World War, and we have lost everything apart from University of Copenhagen. And especially within 50 years, we lose quite a lot of it. So in 1918, Iceland became an independent country. We lost that university as well. And the First World War ended, and Germany lost. And we had this whole territory, the southern part of Denmark, the duchies, the Schleswig-Holstein-Gottorp. And we had a referendum in Schleswig to see which part should belong to Denmark and which part should belong to Germany. And we got the northern part back to Denmark. That was a situation in 1920 when the government said, well, we should have a second university in Denmark. We've had quite a few, we've lost them all. It's time we have a second university in Denmark. So where should we actually locate that? And 3 towns in Jutland started lobbying. That was the town of Sønderborg near the German border, where they said, well, we should have the university here because this part has belonged to Germany from 1864 until now, and it's a way of strengthening the sense of being Danish in this part of the country, which is actually an equivalent to University of Lund in Sweden in 1666. So that was one answer. Another one was the town of Viborg, where they have a cathedral, and where it was actually sort of a more learned town than the University of Aarhus, than the town of Aarhus, which was the second biggest town or city in Denmark. But it turned out to be the Aarhus which won, which was actually because they had some local businessmen. They were lobbying very actively, and I think you might say it's one of the first examples of a private-public partnership in building this university, because the state didn't want to finance it fully. So the municipality had to finance it. Some of the local businessmen financed, and it didn't get. And at first, the government said we will only fund the daily costs. You have to pay for the buildings yourself. So it was a bit hesitant the way that the government actually agreed to that university. And what was a bit funny was that the professors in Copenhagen, they said, well, we can't have a university in Jutland. It's too far away and it's too remote and provincial. No decent professor would ever live there. But it hasn't been a problem, apparently, to get people to live there. Then the next three universities are actually sort of part of the whole Mars University thing that we have seen all over Europe. So the third university was located in the third biggest city in Denmark. The reason was that they wanted a faculty for medicine because they had problems with training enough medical doctors. And then they said, well, in the middle of the country, that makes sense to have one there. Then Roskilde University and Aalborg University, they are established at almost the same time. And the reason for that is that they said, well, it's about time we get a fourth university of Denmark. And the government at that time, the right-wing government, said, well, it should be in Copenhagen to relieve the pressure on University of Copenhagen. But then the opposition, the Labour opposition, said, no, it should be in Northern Jutland because we need regional development. In Northern Jutland, people have the lowest educational rate. We need regional development, so we should locate it here. And a typical Danish compromise was that we'll do both. So they actually established a university both in Aalborg, which was the fourth biggest town, and one just outside Copenhagen in Roskilde. And they were also different in terms of the pedagogies they used. And I think, and I haven't read that anywhere, but Roskilde University especially, I think perhaps they were inspired of the whole idea from Oxford and Cambridge. But they were very progressive at that time, so I don't think they preferred to sort of look back and have that reference. But they have actually, the way the campus is built is actually that they have separate houses, and each house should be sort of a self-governing body. So that was quite radical at that time. At least that's the way the story has been told. But then listening to you, I always thought, well, that's just looking back in time. But I think in terms of campus, it's quite interesting. It was located outside Roskilde on a windy spot, and I suppose perhaps it was cheap out there. And the trains usually they just pass by. It's not all trains that stop there, so it's not a place where the students actually like to stay, or the staff either. So it's not a place where you actually live, and that affects sort of the whole place. The university in Aalborg, that was located in the outskirts in an industrial area, probably to get sort of a triple helix. I've been there twice, and every time I've been so surprised that was actually a university, because I've just felt I was in an industrial neighborhood, and I didn't know that it wasn't a factory, that it was actually sort of a place where they produced knowledge. I felt awkward and felt that it wasn't really, well, giving the honor that institutions should have. But that's just to tell you a bit about sort of university location and establishment, that it has been varied quite a bit through history, where we find it also appropriate to locate a university. Then the University of Greenland and Faroe Islands, as you can see, it has to do with their steps towards independence. And I think that's an important point, that even today having a university is a very important step when a country becomes independent. It's part of having your own flag, of having your own national anthem, it's part of the whole sort of national identity to have a university, because you would like to control knowledge production and education of people. So in that respect, a university is a very important thing. And in that respect, it's also a local thing. So that was sort of fast forward. I won't go into detail with this regional analysis, but that's another way of looking at it, where we've seen, well, looking at this part of the country, where have there been plans, where have there been wishes of having a university, and what have the different arguments been? Sometimes, because this is such a contested area, sometimes people have said, well, we should have a university here to benefit from the close connection to the Holy Roman Empire. Oh, we should have one to make this part of the country more Danish. So there have been suggestions of Flensborg, Kiel, Kolding, Slesvig and Sønderborg as a matter of fact, you can see recently they have managed to get one almost in all the places. But that's more in the paper about that. So just to round off, I've made a typology inspired by Andrew Sayer, who's also geography, his thoughts about iterative abstraction, or the ideas about ideal types. And it's a typology about reasons for establishing universities. One reason could be local control over education and knowledge production, and that's initiated by the emperor or the people wanting independence. So that would be Oslo, for instance. Or it could be a reason for strengthening local power in a remote and contested area, for instance, in Lund. Another reason could be regional development in marginal areas. And that could be either initiated by the state, but it could also be initiated locally. Or it could be education, like in the missionaries wanting to establish a university. And finally, it could be this step towards building a nation state. So I see sort of different reasons for establishing a university. And then the next step in our thinking is, so does a typology, do these different types relate to different places, ways of locating the university itself? And then I should mention that location can be seen at two different scales. It can be location where within the country or where within a city. So it's more where should we place the campus. And this is where I don't know whether it makes sense or not. Sort of the most traditional way would be, and that relates to the first reason for establishing a university, that would be in the city or in the capital close to the cathedral. That is sort of the traditional location of a university, right? Or the geopolitical reason, when you want to establish a university to conquer in a country you have conquered, then you would take the most important or symbolic town, like Lund. Or it could be what I've labeled the market location. Then you want the regional development, and you would locate the university together with industry, for instance, in the outskirts of town or on cheap land. That's what we've seen more recently. It could be the fourth one, with the universities in Serampore, for instance. I have called that coincidental location, because it's just a coincidence that they located a university there, so it doesn't really matter where exactly. Location isn't of importance. And finally, what I've called the national location, that's when we have established new universities in a new country, a new nation state, and there the university would have a much more prominent place. It would be located in the middle of the city, of the capital. And I think especially if we look at the universities, the most recent universities, for instance, you compare University of Aalborg to some of the universities in university in Greenland or the Faroe Islands. They wouldn't choose to locate the university in Greenland, in Nuuk, out on the outskirts of town, because that's not what you would do if you want a university, because that's important for your national identity. Then you won't choose to locate it on sort of a more marginal area. Then that's a prestige project, where it seems that when it's this more sort of regional development idea, it's more appropriate to locate it, for instance, in the outskirts of town together with industry. And I don't know if it's taking it too far to compare the reasons for establishing a university with where you would actually locate it, but that's what I want to discuss with you. So I think I'll just conclude by saying that, what we could see here by having sort of a geographer's view on history, that due to territorial reduction, Denmark actually lost 3 of its 4 universities within 50 years. And so we can't understand Danish university history without looking at how the state actually developed. So I think these things are important. And often when we look into the literature, it is as if a university has only belonged to one country. And I think it's important to see that in parts of Europe, a university can have belonged to different countries during the course of history. And I think that's an important point, that taking sort of state construction into the picture makes it more complicated, but it's also interesting to see how universities have actually played a role in forming the different states of Europe. And finally, I think Well, these are some of the contributions of geography to university history. It's understanding how university funding and location has been used for state building. And it's also understanding how universities have been used as a political instrument. So that was it.